Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science Podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha, Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com. And this week I am so delighted, so happy, and excited to be introducing our special guest on the show today. We have with us Dr. Roger Cohn, who is the founder of Courage Therapeutics, as well as a professor of molecular and integrative physiology at the University of Michigan, and a world-leading expert in the neuroscience of weight regulation. Courage Therapeutics is a spin-out company from the University of Michigan, and it has two programs to address obesity and restrictive eating disorders, such as anorexia and nervosa. Dr. Cohn's company is developing novel treatments for both obesity and eating disorders, and he has over 30 years of research experience and is best known for his groundbreaking work on the melanocortin system in the brain, which plays a key role in controlling hunger, energy expenditure, as well as body weight. Dr. Cohn's discoveries of the melanocortin 3 and 4 receptors, MC3R and MC4R, have helped shape our understanding of obesity and eating disorders. Dr. Cohn's work continues to influence the development of next-generation therapeutics that target the brain's appetite-regulating circuits. Backed by a $7.8 million seed investment, Courage Therapeutics programs are positioned to complement existing GLP-1 therapies and move into clinical trials soon. Dr. Cohn is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. So to learn more about the work that Dr. Cohn is continuing to lead in this field, being a pioneer in the field of sorts as well, and the work that he is specifically spearheading at Courage Therapeutics, let's turn to him now. Dr. Cohn, thank you so much for being on the show with us.
Thank you, Ayesha.
And you've spent over 3 decades in the field and have, like I mentioned, again, pioneered and made some great groundbreaking discoveries. How do you even reflect on that? And I'd like to learn more about what got you interested in this very niche field, I would say, really the connection between neural regulation, energy balance, appetite, and how you came upon the melanocortin system. So I'd like to know about your journey into really your work and discoveries in the space.
So, Ayesha, when I began my career, there were no obesity genes known. But the Jackson laboratories had identified 5 monogenic obesity strains over the years and had kept them in their repository. And this was in the early days of cloning. And they gave those strains the name OB, DB, fatty, tubby, and agouti. OB and DB led to the discovery of the leptin hormone, the hormone that fat makes to tell the brain how much long-term energy stores you have. And DB encodes the receptor for leptin. That's the work of Jeff Friedman elucidating the leptin system. And my group focused on the agouti obese mouse, a mouse that had 2 phenotypes due to a single gene mutation, yellow coat color and severe early onset obesity. And ultimately, we discovered what caused obesity in that animal, and it turns out it was a defect in the melanocortin system. The melanocortin, there are 5 melanocortin receptors, and they regulate everything from hair color to energy homeostasis. And it turns out that the defective mutation in the agouti animal impacted both the MC1 receptor in melanocytes and the MC4 receptor in the brain that regulate energy homeostasis and that are critical for communication of the leptin signal from fat cells to feeding centers in the brain. So it's been, just a really exciting and fun career to go all the way from the time in the field when there was not a single gene known that regulated body weight to participation in identification of some of the key genes, and some of the key issues impacting human patients. So not only are mutations in the melanocortin 4 receptor the most common cause of human early onset syndromic obesity, but additionally, there's now a drug on the market that acts on the MC4 receptor to treat certain forms of syndromic obesity. That drug is MC3R or setmelanotide from Rhythm Pharmaceuticals. So it's been really amazing in my career to go all the way from really nothing known through we have some of the key genes and regulators in this pathway to actually drugs on the market helping patients.
Yeah, that must be something to see that evolution and to be part of that evolution. And I think that's definitely really exciting. And also in terms of in the field, like just having, like you said, no knowledge whatsoever, and then going to really helping to define and identify those targets and those genes. That must be really something. And so in terms of, you're both in academia and in industry. So it's very interesting because we see a lot of people perhaps maybe make a full transition from academia to industry, or maybe back from industry to academia, but you're still very active within both academia and now with this spin-out company, Courage Therapeutics, which you founded. And so how has that integration been, I would say, in terms of really balancing academia and the goals and space of industry?
So my role at Courage is I'm an advisor to the company, but my full-time job is a professor at the University of Michigan. The really fun thing about having a foot in both worlds is that each, I think, strengthens the other. So in our drive to develop best-in-class melanocortin compounds to treat unmet medical needs, including syndromic obesities that can't be treated with the existing therapeutic setmelanotide, as well as to find better ways to treat dietary obesity. We've done a lot of pharmacology and drug discovery in collaboration with Courage that provides my lab some amazing world-class pharmacological tools to answer some of the basic science questions too. So I think there can be a really nice interplay where the industrial work aids basic science, the basic science adds industrial development, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, to really have that synergy is really there, which we're seeing, I think, more and more so, because I think previously it was thought that the two worlds are completely separate and disparate, but it's really great to see that both can complement each other.
And can I add one more point here?
Absolutely, yes.
So everybody knows how hard it has become to get NIH grants. NIH, DOD, all the federal agencies also support a special class of grants, SBIRs and STTRs, that tend to fund it at higher rates than ARA ones. And so I've written multiple grants with Courage, which has funded basic research and development work as well. And so it's a great way to fund the research that's needed to get new drugs developed and into the clinic as well.
Yeah, indeed. And in terms of Courage Therapeutics, what led you to really to found or to take that step in entrepreneurship almost? But I know you're on the board currently, but really to venture into that world. And can you tell us a bit more about the focus and the core mission and goals of the company?
Sure. So, there are some initial drugs on the market that act on the melanocortin receptors, and Rhythm got there first and was very successful in developing the first melanocortin for syndromic obesity. But I actually did some of the early research for Rhythm, and what we discovered was the drug had some unfortunate side effects and also was not very potent. So it's able to treat a few rare genetic obesity syndromes, but it was not sufficiently potent to treat MC4 haploinsufficiency, which is the most common genetic obesity syndrome, with frequencies as high as 1 in 1,000 people. Furthermore, the rhythm compound is a pan-agonist. It's a very early stage drug in the field, a pan-agonist that has the side effect of hyperpigmentation via activation, cross-reactivity with the MC1 receptor. So it struck me that, first of all, it would be possible to develop second generation, better, more potent, more specific melanocortins for the field. And secondly, my group had spent a lot of time characterizing another melanocortin receptor in the brain, the MC3 receptor. And over the last few years, we discovered some really novel properties to this receptor that could make it a really valuable drug target for other indications, such as eating disorders and disorders of inadequate nutritional intake, like anorexia nervosa, cachexia, et cetera. So not only did I feel there were opportunities to make next generation MC4 agonists, but I was very interested in trying to develop agonists of the MC3 receptor for other eating disorders. And so that led to the interest in creating Courage Therapeutics with Dan Hausman, my other founder from Boston.
Wonderful. And you did touch on this in terms of some of the unmet needs in the space for eating disorders like anorexia nervosa and cachexia, in terms of, and so that's why there is a need to develop next generation therapeutics. And so what are those unmet needs? Is it that there are certain subsets of patients that don't respond to current therapies? Or is it just that existing drugs are not quite there, and so developing next generation drugs would help universally or certain subsets of patients? What are those unmet needs and challenges currently in this space?
Great question, Ayesha. So there are no approved therapeutics at all for anorexia nervosa, ARFID, cachexia. There's really nothing out there. And so complete unmet medical needs for all those disorders that I mentioned. Also, there's failure to thrive in children. There's, the anorexia of aging, which is a very serious problem in the elderly. So there's all kinds of unmet medical needs out there. And there's a lot we need to learn. These are very difficult syndromes without good animal models and without good genetics backing them up, by and large. And so there's very few people working on them. There's very few pharmaceutical companies addressing anorexia nervosa, to just take one example. Anorexia nervosa has as high a morbidity and mortality as any of the other neuropsychiatric diseases, impacting 1% of women. And yet, whereas the NIH spends $200 million a year on schizophrenia and autism and other neuropsychiatric disorders, it invests about 1/10 of that amount on anorexia nervosa. So it's really under-researched and a major unmet medical need. What my group and others showed over the years was that the melanocortin system, the melanocortin circuits in the brain, do exert a bidirectional control on feeding behavior and energy stores. So when you activate MC4, you inhibit food intake and produce weight loss. But when you block MC4, you increase food intake and you increase energy storage. So it struck me that there may be ways to utilize the leptin melanocortin system to treat some of these disorders. And indeed, there's some preliminary evidence that in certain conditions, leptin itself can have therapeutic utility in severe anorexia nervosa. Completely counterintuitive, but the clinical data supports that. So, leptin acts primarily through the melanocortin system, or it's a critical set of circuits for leptin action. So that supports the argument that melanocortins may have applications as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting and I don't think maybe perhaps people knew that conditions like anorexia don't have any approved treatments. And so that's a great unmet medical need. And I think it's a condition that's often very overlooked, I feel.
Absolutely.
And when you think about it, you don't really think therapeutic options as you do, let's say, for something like obesity, which is the flip.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the current therapeutic modality for anorexia nervosa is psychiatric therapy, talkie therapy, and or ultimately, patients get hospitalized and tube fed to bring their body weight back up, and then very high relapse rate following hospitalization.
Yeah, those are really important insights to have, especially when we're talking about the field and the space. So thank you so much for highlighting that and those unmet needs. And in terms of, from a translational perspective, as you mentioned, the synergy between academia and industry and how you're really able to take learnings from both spaces and to translate from academia, translate therapies into therapeutics for patients on the industry side. And so what are some of the key challenges in developing therapies in this particular space and targeting this particular axis or pathway in terms of direct impact on the brain's hunger and energy regulation centers?
Great question. So I'll deal with each indication separately. So, the challenges in the obesity space are obviously that you have this incredible success of drugs like Wegovy and Zepbound.
Yeah, I was just going to
And
get into
then
those. Yes, so we're
you
definitely going to
all
have a
the major-
conversation. Yeah.
all the major pharma companies and many biotech companies chasing, some space in that area, in that incredibly important area. And so the challenge there is doing something unique that's really beneficial for the patients. And so Courage Therapeutics is very much focused on that. And we believe we've identified an approach that can synergize with the GLP-1 drugs in order to allow lower dosing and reduce side effect profiles of those drugs in patients, and perhaps achieve even greater weight loss in some patients as well. So I can tell you a little bit about that if you're interested, how we're approaching that, and the basic hypothesis underlying those observations. Additionally, on the other side of the coin, on eating disorders, the challenge is funding and interest. Believe it or not, you think some major unmet medical need like anorexia nervosa would be easy to fund. It's extremely difficult to fund. Pharma companies aren't interested. Venture firms aren't interested. And it's partly because of the science. There is no animal model for human anorexia nervosa. So that makes it difficult to develop drugs. We don't have the same genetic data validating targets for anorexia nervosa that we do have for obesity and other disorders. The genetics of anorexia, while there is a very significant genetic component to the susceptibility to the disease, the genetics are way behind, and it'll be many years still before we have the kind of robust genetic understanding and validation of potential targets for anorexia nervosa that we have for obesity. So very different problems in the two areas. In obesity, enormous amounts of money and everybody chasing that. In anorexia nervosa and other eating disorders, very little money and nobody wants to invest in it, and nobody's chasing it. And we lack a lot of the basic data that we'd like to have.
Wow, that's very interesting. Two very contrasting, flip sides of the coin indeed. And do you also think perhaps the lack of interest in funding on the eating disorder side for conditions like anorexia nervosa has also to do with perception of what the disorder is? Maybe it's perceived as being more of a psychological or neuropsychiatric disorder as opposed to having a concrete pathophysiologic basis as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It was not perceived as having a genetic or a molecular basis. And that's ridiculous when you look carefully at the disease. The age of onset is very stereotypical, and the fact that 95% of the disease occurs in women with the peak onset around the age of puberty. I mean, it's clearly a neurodevelopmental disorder. But again, without animal models, it can be really hard to identify targets and validate them.
And why has it been so difficult to establish animal models for anorexia? Is it because just the genetic and molecular mechanisms are just so uncertain and not known?
Probably a variety of reasons. First of all, it's multigenic. It's there are really no valid monogenic models like we had for obesity. There were single gene mutations that identified the adipostatic factor, the factor that fat uses to tell the brain how much energy you have. So there haven't been monogenic mutations identified. It's a polygenic disorder that always makes it much more difficult. And the unusual neuropsychiatric onset of the disease makes it impossible to study in anything other than the human. In other words, the fact that, for example, patients with restricting type anorexia nervosa lose a lot of weight, and yet they believe they are fat. And you can't ask a mouse or an experimental animal how it feels about its body weight. So that neuropsychiatric component can't be addressed in an animal model. But what we believe, and what the leptin data from, for example, Hebebrand's lab in Germany shows, is that whereas the onset has this profound neuropsychiatric component, the reduced energy state over time has effects on its own, and we believe those can be treated. In other words, maybe the onset is neuropsychiatric and is a behavioral neuropsychiatric disorder that's going to be really hard to understand. But after a patient loses a lot of weight, there are psychiatric changes downstream of weight loss. And this is clear from many, many studies in different areas. Starvation itself has neuropsychiatric effects. And we believe those can be treated, not to mention the metabolic effects of being underweight. A classic example is the treatment of lipodystrophy with leptin. So lipodystrophy is a series of disorders where people are unable to store fat due to mutations in the mechanics and the proteins required to store fat in fat cells. And they develop a whole series of metabolic syndromes and depression. And those metabolic symptoms and the depression can be treated by providing back leptin. Yes, so there's evidence that that leptin can also treat the anxiety, and from Hebebrand's group in Germany, as I said, there's evidence that leptin can treat the depression and anxiety associated with long-term anorexia nervosa, and by treating that, you can significantly aid patients in regaining weight and regaining health. So very complicated disease, but we believe there may be a role for the leptin melanocortin pathway in treating critical aspects of the disease.
Wow, very complex and very, very interesting. The more interesting, the more complex, and the more complex, the more interesting, I think. Really about cracking the code. And like you said, it's polygenic, and so it's just it's multifactorial and so many factors at play, and probably a plethora of genes involved. And so, hopefully we'll get close to deciphering all of those mutations and mechanisms. And
they're great. Yeah. The development of good, safe molecules to stimulate food intake and appetite are going to have lots of applications beyond anorexia nervosa as well. And that's where Courage's MC3 program comes in. So, for example, the anorexia of aging. People age, they lose their appetite, they're unable to maintain their weight, then they break a hip or have other accidents that cause significant morbidity and mortality in the elderly. Being able to improve appetite and weight maintenance in the elderly is very, very important, and we believe that that's going to be a more straightforward opportunity for the use of the melanocortin system to maintain appetite, food intake, and health, without the neuropsychiatric aspects associated with anorexia nervosa. So we're focused on multiple applications of the melanocortin system to eating disorders, and anorexia nervosa is one of them, but there are other important ones as well.
Absolutely. And going back to the GLP world and side of things, I would really love to get your perspectives on. You did touch on this in terms of how really melanocortin-based therapies can be synergistic with GLP-1 drugs, and so how do you see that synergy being built, and what kind of a sell is it going to be in terms of selling it to the GLP-1 people and market out there, in terms of because GLP-1s are, obviously the rage right now, but they are not perfect, and I think people are coming to understand that more and more, so that they're not a miracle class of drugs as I guess they were once. I mean, they still are kind of touted to be really a groundbreaking class of drugs, but there are limitations. And so how can the melanocortin leptin axis be synergistic with that and fit into that space, or perhaps vice versa?
Yeah, great question. So the GLP-1 family of drugs are drugs that mimic a gut peptide, GLP-1. And those gut peptides act in the brainstem to ultimately tell your brain how full you are. And by tricking the brain into feeling full, you eat less and lose weight. And that's what the data shows very clearly. In contrast, the melanocortin system is primarily in the hypothalamus. And multiple groups have shown, Kevin Williams, Amber Aladef, et cetera, that ultimately the hypothalamic circuits are necessary for the communication of the brainstem information from GLP-1. So if you block the melanocortin system in the hypothalamus, you can block the inhibition of food intake by the GLP-1 drugs. What we discovered at Courage was that if we prime the central melanocortin system, we can make any of the GLP-1 drugs fivefold better, fivefold more potent in terms of the dose-responsive inhibition of food intake and weight loss. We've shown and published that we have compounds that can even be used at sub-threshold doses on their own. So in other words, melanocortin compounds will inhibit food intake in dietary obesity, not as potently as the GLP-1 drugs, as semaglutide or tirzepatide. But we've shown that with certain Courage compounds, we can just simply prime the melanocortin system without fully activating and inhibiting food intake and dramatically increase the potency of the GLP-1 drugs without increasing their side effect profile. So we believe there's going to ultimately be two potential opportunities for melanocortin drugs in dietary obesity. One is to allow people to use the GLP-1 drugs at lower doses and avoid side effects. And the other, for those that can tolerate them, is to potentially even get more weight loss from the GLP-1 family of drugs. You hear about the massive amount of weight loss from Zepbound and Wegovy. If you actually look at a plot of the weight loss per patient, there's a significant percentage of patients who, even after a year of treatment, only lose 5 or 10% body weight. And for some people, that's not that's not enough weight loss. So anyway, two opportunities. One is to be able to lower the doses of these drugs to avoid their side effects. And that extends not only to the nausea that prevents many people from staying on the drugs, but also to the loss of lean mass that's seen in particular with tirzepatide. So it's an interesting application. Many companies are trying to find other gut peptides that they can combine with GLP-1 to achieve these things. I think Courage is rather unique in having a hypothalamic compound that can be administered at very low doses and at sub-threshold doses to improve the behavior of the GLP-1 drugs.
Right. And dare I say that takes courage to do so in a GLP world that we're living in. And I really like the name of the company. If you don't mind me asking, was there any specific thought behind it, or?
Absolutely. So the company really was founded first and foremost to focus on eating disorders. And because of the lack of funding and the lack of interest in the pharmaceutical community, it takes courage to try to make a company to treat eating disorders. So that's where the name Courage came from. We had these two programs, and it just happened that the MC4 agonist program for obesity and syndromic obesity moved very quickly, and we were able to quickly achieve some of our chemical goals and our development goals there. I would say the eating disorder program has moved more slowly simply because it's been harder to raise money. We have good lead candidates, and with this new round of investment, I believe we'll be able to move that program forward more quickly now as well.
And can you talk to us a bit about the programs in terms of where they are in development, clinical data, preliminary data, anything that you can share with us?
So the MC4 program is moving along very nicely. We have a research collaboration with a strategic partner, and because of the enormous cost of dietary obesity trials and the position of the major pharmas in this field, we'll be looking for a strategic partner for that work, and the company will look to find the right clinical indication for our compounds in the syndromic obesity space. So, by the way, I sort of didn't do a good job explaining the overall landscape of obesity treatment. On the one end, you've got these early onset syndromic obesities that impact kids, that are really deficiencies in CNS function that lead to obesity. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got common dietary obesity, affecting 40% of Americans.
Yeah.
And that's where the GLP-1 drugs are being best applied. There's an enormous space in between. So setmelanotide currently is only effective, the current MC4 drug, setmelanotide, is only effective for a very small fraction of people with syndromic obesity. There's many forms of syndromic obesity: MC4 haploinsufficiency, Prader-Willi syndrome, Smith-Magenis syndrome, where where setmelanotide is not effective. So there is this, there are a large number of syndromes where we believe there may be applications for second generation melanocortin compounds. And then there's the opportunity to develop molecules that can be used to synergize with the GLP-1 compounds as well. So the company is hoping to be in the clinic in 12 to 18 months in one of the clinical indications in the syndromic obesity area.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. And so it really appears that it's important to diversify the therapeutic toolbox, let's say, again, beyond just hormone mimetics, which obviously have their place, especially given the very complex neurobiology of eating behaviors and in turn eating disorders.
In the eating disorder space, we have good lead compounds that need work to advance them to drug candidates. And so this new investment will help to do that. We've been stalled in doing that for simple reason of funding. We have really good starter molecules that are potent and specific, and we just need to modify them to make them into effective therapeutics. And I think we have a fairly straightforward path there with the funding that we have now.
Right. And so when we talk about funding and really the whole ecosystem that goes into drug development, and you mentioned partnerships, and what kinds of who are the stakeholders and players within that ecosystem? Funders, of course, venture capitalists, but then funding from government agencies, and the role of advocacy groups in driving some of that funding, fundraising. So the patient, of course, being at the center of that. So what does that whole ecosystem look like, and who are the important stakeholders within it?
I mean, the ecosystem for obesity is, every major pharma and many VCs, and of course the NIH through NIDDK primarily has been an outstanding funder of research and really funded all the work that led to identification of the drug targets. So the identification and the validation of the MC4 receptor, of leptin receptor, all funded by NIH and NIDDK heavily. The work was heavily done in academia, which is why we need the government to continue to fund basic research and health research through the NIH. All the major discoveries were made in academia. With regard to, in terms of the basics of energy homeostasis, a lot of the critical work in the GLP-1 space was done in both academia and in industry, with major advances being made at Novo and Lilly, but also, Joel Habner cloned the GLP-1 gene, and Dan Drucker and Jens Holst in academia really advanced the understanding of how GLP-1 works. And then the development to go from the very weak native hormone to the drug-like analog was primarily done in industry and required industrial funding and research programs. In anorexia, and eating disorders, the landscape is much more bleak. Not adequate funding from the NIH, not adequate funding from industry, lack of interest from venture capital because it's just too complex and daunting a problem. They need to see a clear path to a drug in the market soon to want to fund things, and that just is hard to do in anorexia nervosa without animal models and genetic validation. I don't know if that answered your question, Ayesha.
No, it really does. Again, just placing the key elements and players in this space, I think that's important. And again, underscoring the importance of funding and the courage that it takes to really drive the basic research forward to get to those milestones and in drug development in terms of getting a therapeutic compound. And I think you're positioned so fantastically, really having being on the academic side, making those very important foundational discoveries and getting those biological insights and then translating them. So I think you're the best person really to be in this and really having an understanding and driving this kind of work forward. And I think we need many more of your types, and hopefully other players and stakeholders can really understand the importance and the time it takes. I think, having been in grad school and research myself, I think people often don't understand the time it takes to really, get that research and get those experiments done and to produce those results. It's a different ball game. I think in industry, the timelines, the goals are quite different. So maybe that disconnect is there sometimes.
Yeah, the public doesn't understand how complicated biological systems are,
yes.
How hard it is to go from a basic finding to a drug. In fact that we validated the MC4 receptor as a drug target for obesity in 1997.
97.
The
Okay,
first
so there you
FDA
go. That
approved.
will almost be, what, 30 years?
Yeah, the FDA approval for setmelanotide was 2020.
Wow. So that
yeah.
tells you, yeah. So the next question here is, what role do you see neuroscience playing in the next generation of metabolic and weight-related therapies? I think it's very clear the role of neurological pathways. And do you think that this is going to be and continue to be a major focus moving forward, or is it going to remain gut hormones that people are going to continue chasing? What do you see the field leaning towards in the coming years?
So I'm biased in this regard, but I'll cite some data that supports my bias. Obesity and energy homeostasis and anorexia, these are all CNS disorders. Steve O'Reilly, a famous clinical geneticist in the field, uses the analogy of the bathtub. As long as the water's in the bathtub, as long as the fat is being stored in the adipocytes, the organism is safe. Yes, there are consequences of having too much adipose tissue. It increases the risk for a number of other diseases. But the moment you try to prevent the adipocytes from storing fat in the periphery, if you don't change food intake, that fat goes elsewhere. It goes to the liver, it goes to the muscle, you get hepatotoxicity, steatosis, and there, nobody, to my feeling, nobody has succeeded in figuring out a way to act in the periphery to reduce the fat in fat cells without it going somewhere else. All the treatments that work, MC4 agonists like setmelanotide, the GLP-1 compounds, they act in the brain to reduce food intake. And you reduce food intake and you naturally, slowly over time, over a year, slowly over time, reduce, use up fat in a healthy way in your fat stores and reduce body weight. Every treatment that's been looked at so far that acts on adipocytes has been ineffective. In addition, and caused, unacceptable metabolic consequences. Similarly, if you look at the GWAS, the quantitative genetic analysis of genes contributing to body weight, the vast majority of them are in the brain. They're not in the periphery. In contrast to type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes, where they're in the periphery. It's a defect in the beta cell, for example. So I'm biased towards things that act in the CNS. The GLP-1 drugs, of course, are acting primarily in the CNS for weight loss. They act peripherally to improve insulin release, but they act centrally to produce weight. So I have a hard time. I get asked to look at all the time at new pathways in the periphery that might be used to treat obesity or might be used in conjunction with the GLP-1 drugs by also increasing fat burning in the periphery. And haven't seen anything that I feel good about yet. But then again, I'm a neurobiologist, so you go to a surgeon, they're going to recommend surgery.
That's right, but I think you have some solid science, decades worth of science to back your perspective, and I think definitely there's growing. I think with the GLP-1s and all of that, I think really recognizing that obesity and eating disorders do have a very strong primarily neuro biological component. I think that's definitely more and more recognizable for sure now. Right. And I think I would say, from my preliminary understanding and in conversation with you, I think you have me convinced, at least, that this is where the field should and looks to be going. And in terms of looking ahead, what excites you most about the future of obesity and eating disorder research, despite things looking bleak, as you very much explained, on the eating disorder side? But what gives you hope, and what things need to happen in order to get the ball rolling, especially on that side? You did touch on some of them, but there must be some things that give you hope and courage to do what you do.
No, I mean, I think the GLP-1 breakthrough was absolutely amazing when you think about it in terms of the history of science. The vast majority of my career, there was one drug after the other. Many, rimonabant and others got taken off the market due to unacceptable side effects. And in any event, none of them had better than 5% weight loss. Suddenly now we have mechanism-based drugs that can produce 10 to 20% weight loss. And that is having, and it's going to continue to have a growing, profound impact on public health. Profound impact. I was just at the ADA meeting looking at the clinical readouts from many of the new GLP-1 drugs, and 15% reduction in cardiovascular events. And oh my gosh, I can't remember the exact number, but it's staggering. 97% or 90 something percent reduction in the onset of type 2 diabetes in people being treated with a GLP-1 drug versus control. Obesity leads to type 2 diabetes. You begin to reduce that obesity. The diabetes, by and large, goes away. It doesn't happen in the 3-year time frame of that study. So the impact of these drugs on the public health is going to be amazing. I'm excited to see the prices start to come down, more competition, prices coming down, so that it's not just people with top shelf insurance. And of course, the insurance companies more and more are recognizing that they can save money by preventing these long-term metabolic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, et cetera. So it's a really exciting time in the field. And, there's already, I think you're starting to see some changes in the eating disorder space as well. There was really hardly anybody working on this space until GDF-15 was discovered. Now there are multiple companies working on GDF-15 for cancer, Cachexia. Pfizer is interested in an MC4R antagonist for stimulating food intake. I think we're going to start to see the same kind of progress in the eating disorders maybe in the next 10 years as well. So very exciting time,
That's awesome.
Both for obesity and disorders.
Indeed. And I think just to close off, I'd like to kind of come full circle back to how, coming from doing groundbreaking research in academia and then spinning out a company, what advice would you have to people looking to do that? And what does it take? And is it an important step to do translational research? And what would your advice be really to embark on something like that?
I run a research institute here at Michigan called the Life Sciences Institute. We have 26 faculty. And, my advice to all the faculty is to pick important problems that have large potential impact and focus on the kind of scientific research that can potentially have significant impact for human health, for society. It's not necessarily always drug development. It can be new diagnostics. It can be new technology. Research is hard. It takes a lot of time. Pick important problems and think about them in terms of the potential impact.
Sound advice. And finally, what milestones can we expect and look forward to from Courage in the coming months and in the next couple of years? I know that you mentioned that you'll have compounds ready to go into trials by 2027. And so what are some of the milestones leading up to that, and what can we look forward to?
So I think milestones will be initiating a clinical trial in syndromic obesity. Another milestone will be a strategic partnership for dietary obesity. And I think a third milestone will be identification of development candidates for eating disorders. Those are the 3 milestones I'm looking forward to.
They sound solid. Dr. Combe, thank you so much for your time today, and it was such a pleasure speaking with you and really learning so much from you, and really commend and appreciate all of the work that you have put into the field and that you continue to spearhead now at Courage Therapeutics. Thank you so much for your time and everything that you do.
Ayesha, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking with you.
All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, which I hope and I'm pretty sure you did, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you very much, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.